I'm pleased to welcome George M. Goodwin today. He's an art and architectural historian with a special interest in synagogues. He belongs to Temple Beth El in Providence, a notable example of modern design and decoration built in 1954. Goodwin, a past president of the Rhode Island Jewish Historical Association, has edited its journal, Rhode Island Jewish Historical Notes, for 19 years. He also co-edited The Jews of Rhode Island, which was co-published by the University Press of New England and Brandeis University Press in 2004. He's a frequent contributor to a monthly newspaper, Jewish Rhode Island.
Thanks. Thanks for having me as a speaker in the wonderful Valley Talks series. I'm delighted to participate. The Rhode Island Historical Society means so much to me. And I'm thrilled that Anne Conway is completing 25 years of service in Woonsocket, that Deborah Krieger already feels like a colleague. Maybe that's because we're both natives of Los Angeles. I was delighted to serve on the board of the Historical Society for a dozen years, and I'm so impressed by what it accomplishes. As for the quarter century of distinguished service in Woonsocket, take a look at the brand new issue of Rhode Island History, and you'll see an outline of what has happened there. Okay, so it's kind of an irony that we're looking at photos of the Woonsocket Synagogue and several others, when perhaps ideally we would be meeting at B'nai Israel and experiencing it in a more important way. On the other hand, I want to share with you several other examples of mostly 20th century synagogue architecture in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and a few other places. So my goal is to present B'nai Israel within a larger context. And yes, to some extent it's regional, but to a larger extent it's national and international. So before we look at the context, let's just take a couple more glimpses of the magnificent windows that were part of the original design. Of course, the architect about whom I'll be speaking extensively was Samuel Glaser, who had a true dream of what he and his colleagues and the congregation could accomplish in Woonsocket. And that is, I think, best expressed through a few shots of the windows, which were the work of an Israeli painter named Avigdor Arika. And it's a fascinating story how he somehow became involved in this project. So I'm going to keep saying next as we move along. So Deborah, please, let's take another couple glances at the extraordinary windows which are found on the sides of the main sanctuary at B'nai Israel. These, to me, epitomize all that was accomplished there, and which I am sure are enjoyed to this day. Okay, moving on, please. We're going to look further at the sanctuary later in my talk. Of course, I think you'll notice right away, if you don't know the synagogue, that these are not representational images. They're abstract, which I think makes them ever more fascinating, that they don't portray obvious or even obscure heroes, heroines, events, stories, that so much of that is left to the worshiper's imagination. Next, please. So any discussion of synagogue architecture in North America begins, of course, in Rhode Island, with the oldest extant synagogue in the US or Canada. This, of course, is Touro Synagogue in Newport, which I assume so many of you know and enjoy. It wasn't the first synagogue in North America, however. Keep in mind that Jews came to New York in 1654, but they didn't build a synagogue until 1730. So if it had survived, it would be the oldest extant synagogue. Why was it destroyed? Well, because in a sense, the community prospered and needed to build a larger building on the same site. And the Congregation Shirth Israel, of course, still exists and flourishes, and I think has built 4 synagogues. Unfortunately, I don't have any interior shots of Truro to show you, but I think it's appropriate to look at some of its windows. And this is a rather obscure shot taken from the back of the building. The major portion is the sanctuary, and to our right would be a connected extension, which was used for everything else that happened in the congregation, meetings, children's education, you name it. Okay, let's go on, please. We're slowly approaching a major view of the Truro Synagogue, which was, of course, erected in 1763. And it was designed by a local architect, Peter Harrison, who did other wonderful buildings in Newport, which you're encouraged to visit. Of course, the Brick Market, which houses a portion of the history collection of the Newport Historical Society. And of course, the wonderful Redwood Library nearby, which still functions as a glorious library. So here's the wing of Truro, and you see reflected in the window on the left, one of the 4 former state houses or capitals. Of course, the capital rotated throughout Rhode Island. Let's move on. And here's a view of the sanctuary from Truro Street. At various times, it has had shutters covering the windows, but one of the most important symbols in Judaism, and therefore of worship and daily life, is light. And Harrison's design is so bountiful in its embrace of daylight, and by contrast, the arrival of evening, marking typically the beginning of the Sabbath. So let's move on, please, Deborah. How did Peter Harrison know anything about what a synagogue was supposed to look like? There not being any other examples in North America. Well, he was British. And of course, Truro was built during colonial rule. He may have known the oldest British synagogue in London, Bevis Marks, which was built in 1701 and still stands and is still used as an Orthodox synagogue. But he also may have studied various books that had drawings of not only Bevis Marks, but perhaps synagogues in Amsterdam, for instance. So on the one hand, this is a modest building. You might even say plain, because it lacks exterior decoration. But this is typical of so many synagogues, and you might even say of Woonsockets, that the magnificence is found primarily indoors, in the sanctuary. Okay, moving on, please. Yeah, I better get going. So here we see Truro, the sanctuary, the original building on the left, and on the right, an 1835 residence, the Levi Gale House, which was acquired by the congregation in 1925, was actually split in half in order to move to the site. And this building became in a sense, the community center where all activities other than prayer services are held. So it's a religious school, there are offices, there's a library, archives, you name it. Because a synagogue performs so many functions in addition to being a house of prayer. Next, please. Well, now we're in Providence, and some of you may know this building firsthand. This is the second home of my congregation, Temple Beth El, whose official name is Congregation Sons of Israel and David. This congregation was the second organized in Rhode Island, the first in Providence in 1855. Like Turo, it originated as a burial society because Jews needed their own burial ground, not being welcome in other places. So Bethel built its first synagogue downtown on Friendship Street in 1890. It was only occupied by the congregation for about 20 years. It was sold to a Swedish Baptist congregation and stood until the 1950s when it was demolished for highway construction. So this is the second Bethel. You'll see the third in a moment. The original building, 1911, the school building, which is attached from the mid-1950s. So what's the appropriate appearance of a synagogue? What style should it assume? Well, there isn't one style that's official, that the appearance continually evolves through the decades and through the centuries, largely reflecting the dominant architectural style of an era or even a nationality. So this is a neoclassical style, and it was used by the congregation until 1954, when a new building was erected, the third on the east side of Providence. Next, please. So now a few quite sad pictures showing the interior. This house of worship was used until the new Bethel was erected, and it was purchased by 4 Orthodox congregations that already existed in the neighborhood. Eventually, a 5th one also joined the joined this congregation and used it into the 1970s, by which time there were no longer Jews living in South Providence. In fact, it was a challenge even to establish the daily minyan, which in conservative or in Orthodox tradition would be 10 men. So eventually the congregation, the subsequent congregation disappeared, and this building didn't serve any further use. Its ownership was entrusted to a Providence Orthodox congregation, which was free to sell its remaining contents and sell it to an owner who would put it to a new use. Unfortunately, however, over the last 15 years, the only thing that has happened to this building is that it's been badly deteriorated and vandalized. This is how it looked about a year ago. Next, please. So this is, that's okay. You're looking at the Bema, the site of the Ark, where the 10 Commandments are stored, where typically the rabbi and other the cantor, the lay people who lead the service, where they stand facing the congregation. But I'm showing you that this 11 congregation had stained glass windows and still does, but they're of course in horrible condition. Next, please. They don't have any iconographical importance. A few do, but by and large, they're decorative patterns, which you can see are in very poor shape. Sadly, they're not distinguished enough to really belong in an important Jewish museum. So what will become of these? Who knows? Next, please. This is one of the few representational or symbolic images at the old Bethel. Jews will recognize this is the eternal light or lamp. But there are also various floral designs and other geometric designs which don't have a particular significance. But all this is leading up to the idea that it was not entirely revolutionary for B'nai Israel and Woonsocket to have a program of stained glass windows. Next, please. Many of you will know that this is Temple Emmanuel on the east side of Providence, which was erected in 1926. This is Emmanuel's first home, and it was organized as a conservative congregation, that is essentially, in theological terms, midway between Orthodoxy and Reform. But it was the second such conservative congregation in Providence, but it was the first to build its own home. And this was a typical form for American synagogues of the 1920s. It's essentially an historical and eclectic design which embraces many architectural traditions, including Roman, Byzantine, early Christian, but nothing inherently Jewish. So here's the main entrance on Morris Avenue, and then we'll step inside and notice stained glass windows. So here's the main sanctuary facing the ark and the bima, the platform from which the service is conducted. A more recent innovation is the placement of a lectern in the aisle, the central aisle, which is used by the cantor. This somewhat mimics the Sephardic or Hispanic tradition, where the clergy stand within the pews and sing and read and pray facing the ark. But they're wonderful stained glass windows throughout the sanctuary, and we'll take a closer look at a few. Moving on, please, Deborah. Here's a shot of Temple Emmanuel from near the bima, facing backward toward the gallery upstairs. In Orthodox tradition, as was true in Truro and Newport, women are segregated from men, and they're usually relegated to the upstairs. They definitely had a lesser status, or at the very least a different status. That's not true here. It's to accommodate a larger audience. It's interesting to me here that the shapes of the pews are somewhat curvilinear to mimic the shape of the sanctuary, but also I think to kind of have the congregation embrace each other. But you'll see it's also rather austere and understated, although the interior was very handsomely restored within the past few years. Next, please. Taking a couple more glances at the stained glass windows. I think it's only coincidental that there are 6 major windows on the eastern and western sides. They do not, in my opinion, represent, say, the 12 tribes of Israel, but they're embellished with wonderful symbolic images, and we'll take a look at these too. But the windows themselves do not have a special purpose other than to emit light and to therefore illuminate to some degree the sanctuary. Moving along, I'm going to show you one of my favorite details of one of these 6 windows on the on the eastern side. This, you may know, is the priestly blessing. And there are various obvious and somewhat obscure images in the decorative scheme. The windows were made by a studio in Syracuse, New York, which did most of its work for churches of all denominations, as well as for very expensive residences and government buildings and so on. Unfortunately, Emmanuel does not have documentation, which preserves any kind of dialogue that its leaders may have had with the Keck studio. But some of the windows were not here when the building opened in 1926. And next, please. Most likely there wasn't this portrait of the facade, which you'll recognize already. And it's interesting to me that at the bottom of this detail, you don't see the name of the family or individual who were the donors or who were memorialized by their family. So maybe there's still an opportunity to donate this window. Moving along, please. This is certainly, no, back up one. This is a window that either Emmanuel members or visitors very seldom see this close. This is at the top of the choir loft, which you can see clearly if you're seated back in the sanctuary. But this, of course, is the burning bush. And I enjoy it also because it seems to have a floral pattern within the rising flames. And you'll note here that in the inscription at the bottom, in memory of the donor's families, most likely you see the years of the husband's and wife's deaths, which is 1929 and 1930. So this wasn't made until at least 1930. Moving along, please. So by the 1950s, it became stylish, challenging, to some degree, an imperative to reject the historical architectural styles of the past and slowly embrace modernism. Now, this is an exception in Providence. This is near Providence College. It was built as a conservative synagogue, Beth David, in 1954. And it was only used until 1980 when the congregation merged with another, Beth and relocated to a new building in Warwick. But this, even though it's 1954, represents the past. This is a Georgian style, well, a style that imitates 18th century taste in Europe and America and elsewhere around the world. But this was a synagogue, believe it or not, with no typical Jewish imagery. Next, please. So this is the third Bethel, built on Orchard Avenue in 1954. Still very much a dynamic congregation, although its current membership, perhaps 750 families, is smaller than it was at its height. Perhaps 30 years ago, there were 1,150, 1,200 families. But this was an early work of an important Jewish architect named Percival Goodman, a New Yorker who had already built a few synagogues in a modern style. But this was his grandest to date, and I believe one of his most successful. Believe it or not, he actually built about 50 American synagogues all over the country, the largest number in the Northeast. But he built more synagogues than any architect in all of Jewish history, which demonstrates again how many congregations were created or moved to new locations in the during the 1950s and 60s. So this is somewhat notable in comparison to Beth David because of the informality of the main entrance. You walk up the steps from Orchard Avenue. This is the main entrance to the sanctuary on the right and a smaller chapel on the left. Further west would be the entrance to the religious school wing and the offices. So this was a giant step into the unknown for Bethel, and also a financial leap. This cost $1.5 million in 1954. I mean, if the value of the dollar has declined, by 90%, imagine how difficult it would be to build something comparable today. And of course, landscaping is a key part of the design, which was certainly not true in most earlier epochs. Keep going, Deborah. So this is the main sanctuary, which is a very unusual plan to expand this core seating area, which seats perhaps 800 people. For the high holy days, which receives the largest attendance, the classrooms behind the curtains can be opened. That is, the curtains are retracted, and seating for another 600 or so can be allowed. A few more shots of this grand theatrical space. You're standing at the back of the sanctuary, facing the bima with the ark in the center, 2 lecterns where the rabbi and cantor or others may speak, chairs for readers or temple officers. The choir loft is invisible because it's above this main floor, as if it were hidden. There's also an organ, but this is a hugely and a dramatic space, which means I think a great deal to historians and architects, but also to lay people. This is and somehow an expression of the dynamism of holiness. And you'll notice on either of the side windows, which were designed by an Israeli artist, Ismar David, who came to New York in the 1950s. And Percival Goodman was aware of his work and commissioned him to do these designs based on Goodman's drawings. But the sanctuary was going to be even more splendid in that Goodman wanted to hire Chagall to design curtains to hang on either side. They would have cost about $100,000, which was considered too expensive. So they were not commissioned. And Goodman also wanted to commission the sculptor Jacques Lipchitz to design bas-relief panels on 2 sides of the sanctuary. These unfortunately were never done. However, there are several notable smaller sculptures by avant-garde New York artists, some of them Jews. And you can't see them here, but there's a candelabra on the left of the bima. There are 2 columns flanking the ark and so on. Okay, moving along, take a couple shots at these windows. Here's from the bima looking backward to the entrance of the sanctuary. And of course, so much has changed for various reasons in that there's now seating for people in wheelchairs or needing special attention, which didn't exist in Goodman's day. The audio system has been improved decade by decade, and the lighting too. Okay, let's move along. Take a quick look at these windows, which have no color. They're etched, and you'll notice a few very familiar Jewish icons, but then more obscure and subtle ones as well, along with many Hebrew inscriptions. Moving along, please. trying to watch the time. And each of these panels was donated by a congregant's family. Okay. Next. This is one of my favorite images portraying the 10 Commandments without the Hebrew letters. I mean, it's perfectly obvious to Jews what these panels are. Next. So this is the chapel at Bethel, also part of Goodman's original design, which seats about 100 people. And the seating configuration has been changed from decade to decade, from rows of pews to individual chairs and so on. But it's for a much smaller occasion, perhaps a Friday night service in winter, or a small wedding, a small funeral, or the daily minyan or prayer service that is held in the evening. Bethel has had such a service since 1954, which is quite unusual for a Reformed congregation. Again, Goodman was responsible for the windows. Ismar David executed them. Above the ark with the 10 Commandments, you have a Hebrew inscription for Shaddai, another word for the Almighty. And it's interesting how different these spaces are, but also how wonderfully they complement each other. Most congregants prefer one over the other, which is fine. Next. Another shot of the chapel. And of course, an abundance of natural light from the dome. Next, please. I did not climb on the roof of the religious school wing. I'm looking out of a window, but here I think is a wonderful contrast of the domed chapel and the main sanctuary, as juxtaposed to the right, the Victorian residence, which is part of the Lincoln School campus. It's a low-key example of modernism, which is intended not to offend next door St. Martin's Church or the neighbors who may not have been so keen on living amidst or near a synagogue. Next, we're getting to Woonsocket, I promise. But just a few other examples of modern interpretations of houses of worship. These are one of the three chapels at Brandeis University in Waltham, which were built in 1955 and designed by a Jew, Max Abramovitz of the firm Harrison and Abramovitz. To me, this is a brilliant idea, architecturally, spiritually, democratically, you name it. There was a pond at the northern end of the Brandeis campus, which was built in 1948. And then rather than build one large sanctuary for Jews and members of other religions, there was a student protest, as a matter of fact, which wanted to properly acknowledge Catholic and Protestant students. At the time, there weren't other religions well represented. So the result was 3 sister chapels surrounding the pond. So you're looking at the Protestant chapel at the northern corner. Next, please. The Catholic chapel toward the south. And then next, the Jewish chapel to the west. And iconographically or symbolically, there's virtually no way to identify which is which I think is a wonderful idea that, in my opinion, and obviously Abramowitz's dream, these chapels show the brotherhood and the sisterhood of humankind in their reverence for the Almighty and the highest forms of human behavior. Moving along. On the left, the Catholic chapel, on the right, the Jewish chapel. Of course, they're small. They seat only about 150 each. Next. Well, just as a way of comparison, I look at all kinds of houses of worship from all traditions, and this is my favorite modern church in Rhode Island. Many of you may recognize that this is Portsmouth School and Abbey on Aquidneck Island, which was designed in 1961, beginning in 1961, but actually over several decades, and the school is still growing, under the supervision of a distinguished American architect born in Italy named Pietro Balluschi, who established his career in Portland, Oregon, and later in the 50s became the Dean of Architecture at MIT. So the campus's key landmark is this chapel, the Chapel of St. Gregory the Great, which is shared by the abbots and priests who live here, as well as the student body. It's a traditional form, an octagonal shape, based perhaps on a famous example in Ravenna, Italy, but modernized in its simplicity. The main entrance is on the left. There are a few other entrances and exits on the side. Keep going. Another shot, different season, of this simple but also monumental modern house of worship. Whenever I go to Newport, I invite myself to stop at Portsmouth Abbey and stroll around the wonderful grounds, and often to enter the sanctuary to think my own thoughts. Next, please. The magnificent interior of Portsmouth Abbey, which has 8 altars around the perimeter, or 7 plus the main altar, and you're looking into the choir where the monks and priests are typically seated. Magnificent windows by an artist I'm going to talk about a little more, a Hungarian-born painter, photographer, designer, Georgi Kepes, who spent the final portion of his career at MIT. So he did the windows. An important avant-garde sculptor named Richard Lippold did the wire sculptures above the altar. Okay, keep going. So you'll see, I know I have to move along, that the Woonsocket Synagogue fits within a contemporary modern tradition, which is far broader than a Jewish context. These are more of Kepes' windows in the choir. Next. All right, I'm gonna have to move even more quickly. This is to show you, I'm not gonna say where this is. This is a synagogue built in 1941. Next. This is the street entrance. The entrance near the sanctuary, which looks kind of 1930-ish and plain. And then we enter the sanctuary proper. Next. Well, here you see the ceiling. And it's so startling and perhaps refreshing to see such an abundant use of color, as well as Jewish, you might say, icons, images, the Star of David, the 10 Commandments, the Torah scroll, and so on. How refreshing Uh, Again, looking up at the ceiling, this is not marble, but painted plaster to resemble marble. Keep going. So this is 1941. And of course, it looks like a synagogue from Eastern Europe. And in fact, it was modeled after one in Lithuania, which was no doubt destroyed during the Shoah, the Holocaust. This is in the Sephardic tradition of the clergy facing the ark. It's now, for better or for worse, a museum, but it's preserved magnificently. In fact, it was restored fully about 10 years ago. Next. And looking from the reader's table to the balcony where the women would be seated. Next. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll tell you where that was. I hope some of you are surprised, unless you've been there and know the building firsthand. It's an Orthodox congregation in Mexico City. Well, now for another celebration of color before we get to Woonsocket. But this had a direct relationship with B'nai Israel's design. These are the windows designed by the Russian-born, later French visual artist who actually spent part of the World War II years in New York City, Marc Chagall, who was primarily a painter, printmaker, but beginning in the 1950s, designed 10 sets or cycles, programs as they're called, of stained glass windows. And these are the most famous by far. There are 12 windows, which are part of the Hadassah Hospital in the Ein Karim area of Jerusalem. Next. So they were erected in 1962, which is the very same year as when the Woonsocket Synagogue was erected. They've faded somewhat, I'm afraid, but they're still so gorgeous, so joyful. They are representational in that they portray the 12 tribes of Israel. Next. I'm getting there, sorry. So the question is, did Samuel Glaser, the architect of B'nai Israel in Woonsocket, to what degree was he influenced by Chagall in his love of boldly colored windows? And surely in a general way he was influenced, but did he know these windows before they were erected? Next, please. Yeah, surely in some sense, but he may not have actually seen these windows. Before they were installed in Jerusalem, they were exhibited in Paris in the summer of '62. And they were also shown in the fall of '62 at an important biennial exhibition in Venice. Well, Glaser and his wife were important collectors of avant-garde art, especially sculpture and illustrated books. I'm sure they traveled widely. In France, they had a daughter who married a Frenchman and lived there. They were au courant with the avant-garde. And if they didn't know these windows, which were manufactured in France, they must have had some sense of their possibility. Next, please. Well, just one moment. You see how small the sanctuary is. Beneath the central window is the ark. So this sanctuary is used infrequently on a regular basis, but occasionally for meditation and so on. Next. This is the rooftop above ground level, showing what the windows look like from the exterior. Next. Finally, Woonsocket, and I'll try to pick this up. Well, members of B'nai Israel and perhaps some other residents of Woonsocket know that this building was the home of the Jewish congregation from early, around, I think 1904, early in the 20th century, until the new building was constructed in 1962. This had been built in the 1890s as a Presbyterian church. Eventually, the Presbyterians built elsewhere. The building was available, and the Jewish congregation, which had been founded in 1893 and soon affiliated with the conservative movement, rented this home and eventually bought it. Unfortunately, I've never been inside it, so I can't quite visualize how it was used. Next, but you can see it's now a church, and I hope it too is rewarded in various ways through the use of the building. Next. Just one more example before we get to the new Woonsocket building. This is a Rhode Island synagogue that was built the very same year as B'nai Israel. This is Temple Sinai in Cranston, Rhode Island, which is a Reform congregation. And it was designed by a Boston firm, Richmond and Goldberg, which built 7 or 8 synagogues in Greater Boston, and also one in New Bedford. It's somewhat unfair to compare Sinai to Woonsocket, because inevitably, I'm sorry to say, that Sinai suffers. And that's not to say in any way that the congregants or the clergy of this congregation are anywhere impeded by having a mediocre building. But I would say by contrast, perhaps, that the clergy and congregants of B'nai Israel have been rewarded by a magnificent building. Okay, next, please. The interior of Sinai, which actually resembles a new synagogue, new for its time, in Portchester, New York, which was designed by a distinguished American and somewhat anti-Semitic architect named Philip Johnson. Samuel Glazer, who was from Boston, had a sister and brother-in-law who were very important art collectors. The Lists, who eventually gave the List Art Building to Brown University. Well, the Lists were instrumental in bringing Philip Johnson to the design of the synagogue in Portchester. And as a result, Samuel Glazer felt offended or overlooked, to say the very least. So this, to some extent, mimics Philip Johnson's building, particularly in the use of the stained glass windows or the colored windows at the altar end. Next, please. And just a few examples. There's no imagery within the glass. Next. But I do think the daylight produces an attractive effect. By contrast, Arika's windows in Woonsocket are so much more imaginative. A side view of the Sinai Synagogue, the sanctuary on the upper floor, beneath it, 2 odd protrusions in the foreground, a library, and behind it, a chapel. Okay, moving right along to 224 Prospect Street in the north end of Woonsocket. And it is sad for everybody involved to see the poor condition of this magnificent synagogue, which I consider one of the significant examples of the post-war World War II era, particularly because of its stained glass windows. But you can see how the stone patio at the main entrance is broken. Well, you know this. especially if you're a congregant. Next, a shot from Prospect Street, looking up the broken steps to the main entrance to the sanctuary, which was really an original idea on Glazer's part. Glazer had built one other synagogue in 1955, a reform congregation in Newton, which still stands. And one of the reasons, no doubt, that the Woonsocket Architectural Search Committee chose Glazer was because of the magnificent use of colored stained glass. But Glazer here came up with an idea I've never seen in any synagogue. The porte cochere, so to speak, at the entrance is an oval or mandala shaped structure representing supposedly the eye of God, supported perhaps by columns that resemble trees or trees of life. And you see on either side of the vestibule 4 of the main windows. There are 30 windows, 16 very large ones, and you'll see some smaller ones as well. Next. This was with Anne and Deborah, Cantor Kornblatt, a few others when we visited about a month ago. We were very happy to get inside, learn more about the building, and take some pictures. Next. It's somewhat odd, however, that this isn't a taller building, that it doesn't portray something more obviously heavenly as you'd expect in a church. And in fact, there is a Catholic church just a few doors down. But this looks, at least from the outside, to be relatively earthbound. And you don't have that feeling inside. Next. Well, let's take a little stroll around the building before we get to the sanctuary, which is the culmination of the design. The rear entrance with a small parking lot facing the school wing, which is, I think, stylish, but would resemble many schools of the 1950s and 60s. Of course, also welcoming an abundance of light. Next. Oh, here's another shot above the main entrance showing what is a Star of David, but obviously in very poor condition. Next. And we're winding our way inside more of the school wing. Next. The plans for the new building were arose by the 1940s, but of course there were World War interfered, aid for Holocaust survivors, for the new state of Israel. There are all kinds of demands on and for Jewish philanthropy. But the synagogue, when it was finally built in 62, was dedicated in memory and in honor of these 5 servicemen who lost their lives in World War II. And as a matter of fact, I know the synagogue members know all the personal connections, which I never will, but I know that toward the bottom here, Herman Earl Kolitz was a cousin of Governor Bruce Sunland. Next. So this is the hallway behind the main sanctuary. This is a huge building for a congregation of only about 200 families. In fact, I knew Rabbi Vicky Lieberman, who was at B'nai Israel from about 1993 to 98 or something. Some of her kids and mine were contemporaries at the Upper Schechter Day School in Providence. And Vicky once said to me, this building is so vast and magnificent, it could house 1,000 families. She did have a point. It's immense. Okay, so here's a hallway. Next. A hallway leading to the sanctuary, which we'll see in a minute, and the rabbi's office. This is interesting to me, very uncommon in any synagogue, is seen in inscriptions inside with the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, at the top of this hallway. You see the Hebrew letters, and then beneath them, next please, you'll see inscribed the names of deceased congregants and their year, the dates of their passings in the Hebrew months. I'm sure you, the Woonsocket congregants will remember, recognize so many loved ones. I should point out that, of course, the congregation has its own magnificent cemetery, which will be preserved in perpetuity, partially because of a recent major fundraising campaign that was partially led by my friend Arthur Robbins. And if he's watching, Arthur, we wish you the best speedy recovery. And his dear cousin, Adele Espo, who's only 98 years old, is joining us from West Palm Beach. Both Adele and Arthur grew up in Providence and are related to so many of these deceased people. Next. Just another story, and I know I'm running out of time, but I'll try and speed this up. All synagogues have zillions of names inscribed all over the place, largely to remember and pay tribute to the deceased. But these names are somewhat different in that they are the donors to an endowment fund. And I, of course, never knew most of these people, but a quick story about somebody I did know. Toward the middle on the left side, you see Solomon L. and Eva Frumson. Well, one day around 1990, I was taking a bus downtown Providence. I seated on the bus, and an elderly woman, maybe now I'm her age, she came up and she said, "Oh, you seem to be studying that bronze statue of the soldiers from the Spanish-American War." And I said, "Well, yeah, it does intrigue me." She said, I want to tell you something. My father, Mr. Frumson, was a volunteer in the Spanish Civil, not the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish-American War. And he fought in Cuba. There were about 1,800 Rhode Island volunteers who served in that war, and the majority ended up to fight in Cuba. So Mrs. Frumson, I enjoyed chatting with her, and she said, "Well, I'm not from Woonsocket, but I'm from a town nearby, Millville. And maybe you know my nephew." I thought, who's that? Well, Richard Israel was the first Jewish Attorney General of Rhode Island. So I enjoyed meeting Mrs. Frumson. Next. Here's one of several lounges in B'nai Israel. This is on the ground floor. The main social hall or ballroom is on a lower level. And obviously, this was not original furniture or carpeting. On the other hand, you can see how brilliant the light is on a sunny day. Next. There are two kitchens. And that's not so, well, this is the smaller upstairs kitchen, which had been recently in use. And you see, to accommodate kosher dietary rules, one of the containers is marked for meat. Next. And here's the chapel. also on the main level, which seats about 100 congregants. It's a much simpler and perhaps harmonious space than the main sanctuary. And this is from which Cantor Kornblatt zooms his Shabbat morning services. I think it's a tranquil space. Unfortunately, however, it's been cluttered up with a lot of stuff, including chairs from another era, what neon lights and a fan, all kinds of stuff. Next. And speaking of clutter, here's the library. Library is always an important part of a synagogue. I don't know the last time there were religious school kids who used it or adults who used it, but I had the really creepy feeling when we visited last month that everybody had left in a hurry. Next. Oh, and here's the ark of the chapel, which was the Hebrew letters representing the first words of the 10 Commandments, and the eternal light in the middle were designed by a very prominent Jewish metalsmith named Wolpert, Israeli-born, who came to America and taught classes at the Jewish Museum for decades. And he has embellished many synagogues around the country. Next. The closer shot. It's interesting to me that the words of the 10 Commandments are not inscribed over images representing the actual tablets. That's left to one's imagination. Next. So here's the rear of the chapel showing 6 of the painter of Victor Orica's watercolor designs for the windows in the main sanctuary. Fortunately, the architect's daughter, Constance Cantar, who lives in Newton and has joined us today, I believe, she very generously paid to have these watercolors and others framed so they'd be protected and enjoyed. Unfortunately, they should not be hung continually here because of the bright light. So the paint is being damaged. These are very valuable in many ways, financially included, and they would belong in any important or unimportant American, French, or Israeli art museum, for instance. Next. The back of the chapel. Next. And here's the rabbi's office across the hallway from the chapel. There hasn't been a full-time rabbi since Vicki Lieberman, but you see more preparatory studies for the windows hanging on the back wall. I assume that this space is used for small study groups from time to time. But these frame paintings should also be moved. Next. Next, please. This is one of my favorite of the preliminary designs. In fact, I don't recognize this window in the sanctuary. Next. So I just mentioned that there were other works of art displayed throughout the building. Some were a gift of Samuel Glazer's sister, Vera List. This oil painting in a hallway, I believe, not signed, was by Georgie Pepys, who designed the windows in the Portsmouth Abbey Church. Next. So here we're looking in the vestibule toward the main entrance on Prospect Street. To the left is the sanctuary. To the right is a meeting hall or auditorium. Approximately 240 congregants can be seated in the sanctuary, but on special occasions or high holidays, the space can be expanded by these folding doors, and worshipers can also be seated to the right in the social hall. Next. And now you have a taste of the, I think, architectural and artistic and transformation that occurs as one enters the main sanctuary on the left. Next. So I'm going to show you 6 or 8 examples of Arica's windows. Arica had never designed any windows up until Glaser found him. And as far as I know, he's only designed a few more subsequently. And these are in Israel. He was born in Romania. He lost family during the Holocaust. He was miraculously brought to Israel at age 15. He already displayed his important artistic talent. And he was enrolled at the Bezalel Art School in Jerusalem, later sent to Paris, which he made a home on and off. But ironically, he was, at the beginning of his adult years, an abstract artist. He went in a different direction beginning about 1965 and became a figurative artist, and is widely admired in America, in Europe, in Israel, and elsewhere for his portraits, his paintings of interiors, of still life, a world around him and us. So this was, next please. And you can, Deborah, you can flip to these at your, on pace, yeah. How did Glaser find Arica? The story is told by his daughter, Constance, that Glaser was on a visit to Paris. He was strolling along. He stumbled on an art gallery. He noticed some of Glaser's abstract paintings and suddenly had a revelation. These are just right for my windows in Woonsocket. The interesting thing again is that Glaser may not have seen the actual Chagall paintings, which were displayed in at the Louvre in the summer of 1961, or he may not have seen Chagall's work at the Biennale in Venice in the fall. But Glaser had this premonition, somehow, this leap of faith that Arica was the right person. Next. So the windows were manufactured in France. We don't have any documentation saying how long it took or what some of the technical issues were. They cost about $40,000 out of a total synagogue budget of around $820,000. So another $20,000 was spent for works of art. Were they made in the same glass atelier as Chagall's windows? Quite likely. And so but I want to mention another French connection. Next, please. We're getting toward the end. Before Arica emerged as a hip, highly regarded painter in the 60s and 70s, he was befriended by a collector in Paris, and this was Alix or Lady or Rothschild, the first wife of the Baron Rothschild, and she encouraged and helped him, and believe it or not, came to Woonsocket for the dedication of the new temple. Next. We're almost finished. So here's kind of a gloomy shot of the sanctuary a month ago. And I think the perspective is exaggerated somewhat. And it looks like the pews are slanted upwards toward the ark. And it looks darker in here than I think it might normally during daylight. But you see, it's a small, intimate space. There's some conjecture as to what the windows may represent. If they're 4 on either side of the entrance, these represent the 8 candles of the menorah of the Hanukkah candelabra. They could, but I doubt it. There's some conjecture that the windows on the facade, front facade, represent the 7 days of creation preceded by the earlier chaos. I kind of doubt that. I think they are glorious homes of color and light, and that's good enough. Okay, next. And as a result, they represent divinity and blessing and peace. Looking back toward the auditorium. Next. And here we have the bima with 3 lecterns, one a permanent one. Why so many? I really can't say. The wooden sculptural decoration is notable for enthusiasts of contemporary or late 20th century sculpture. They surely resemble abstract sculptures by Louise Nevelson. They're not Nevelson's, although she was commissioned by a few synagogues in the 1970s and later. But these were designed by one of Samuel Glazer's colleagues, and most likely do represent a Holocaust memorial, although they're not explicitly called that. Next. There are 6 very small windows on either side of the ark, and these represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Next. And then the ark itself, which has above it the Hebrew letters of the 10 Commandments. The curtains that were commissioned for the ark were probably as visionary as Eureka's windows. They were designed by an important avant-garde textile artist, Ani Albers, who's also known as the wife of important painter Albers. The Torah curtains and a drape above the curtains were in place until a few years ago, and they were sold to the Albers Foundation for a very significant amount. So what you see here are replicas of the Ani Albers textiles. Next. Looking up above the ark, and you see 2 more windows on either side, representing essentially the services of morning and evening. And this too is a Walport Ner Tamid design, but so subtle and ethereal. Next. We're almost finished. Again, to show you the relationship, the bima to the rest of the sanctuary. One more, I think, a couple more. This is a shot from the backside of Bnei Israel. Of course, you're looking above at the main sanctuary. To the left of the tree is the rabbi's office. To the right, the hallway outside the chapel and leading onward to the classrooms and office and so on. Next. So look how far this little congregation traveled in such an perhaps unlikely place from this rather ordinary Victorian church building to a glorious spot in every way of architectural and artistic splendor, to congregational pride and self-confidence and really glory. And we hope and pray that the building and the congregation will survive and flourish again. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
A little longer than assigned, but
So if anyone wants to drop their questions in the chat, we can take a few questions. I see that there's one question that I'm going to read right now from Judith Cushman-Hammer. George, I know the Ani Alber's art curtains are no longer there, but how did Glazer connect with Ani Alber?
that's a good question. Well, as I mentioned, Samuel and his wife Dorothy were very sophisticated art collectors in their own right, particularly sculpture, but also illustrated books and prints and so on. So they traveled in a quite sophisticated artistic circle through the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and they lent pieces for an important show at Harvard. So they were attuned to the avant-garde, and in the post-World War II era, as opposed to earlier eras, Boston and New Haven became centers of avant-garde painting, sculpture, architecture. So to say it rather crassly, the Glazers were pretty darn hip. Okay.
Right. Do we have any other questions? So thank you again, George. I just wanted to let everybody still on this chat know that coming up in May, the Museum of Working Culture will be mounting a temporary exhibition called Mishpacha, Jewish History of Woonsocket. So I've been talking to lots of people who have been affiliated with the congregation, who grew up in Woonsocket as part of the Jewish community. And if you count yourself among those, if you've been a part of the congregation, if you weren't a part of the congregation, but you still lived in Woonsocket, please get in touch with me. I will put my email in the chat. I've been interviewing a lot of people just to get a sense of what it was like, either during to experience the building, to experience the congregation at its peak. And I also wanted to let everyone know that we will be in our gift shop, we will be selling the original 1947 copy of the community cookbook. We have been able to reprint that, and we will be able to sell it. And so I'm going to put the link to that here. I redesigned the cover. It's an amazing cookbook. Over 260 pages of wonderful recipes that the women, the Hebrew Ladies Aid and Sisterhood of the congregation put together, and were able to publish in the 1940s. So if you are local to Woonsocket or Providence, you can order the book and pick it up. They'll be coming from the, they'll be shipped out. They'll be shipping into the museum next week. So.
And we only have 100 copies, so if you want your copy, best to order now.
All right, I'm going to turn off the recording.